The little cul-de-sac in Marigold Townhomes was usually calm, so calm, in fact, that newcomers often remarked on how quiet the evenings were, how neatly trimmed the communal hedges stayed, and how rarely disputes arose. Nestled on the outskirts of a mid-sized American city, the neighborhood offered a semblance of suburban comfort without the hustle of crowded urban life. Lined with attached townhouses, each with a small patch of lawn and a driveway, Marigold Townhomes had a pleasant uniformity that residents generally liked. One day, however, that uniformity was punctured by necessity. Amelia Jennings, a retired schoolteacher in her late 70s, had recently moved into Unit 12 after her daughter insisted she live somewhere safer and more manageable than her old, two-story house. Though outwardly independent, Amelia had begun to experience mobility issues related to arthritis. Navigating steps put strain on her knees and ankles. She could still walk, but steep stairs left her breathless. For that reason, Amelia's daughter, a practical woman named Julie, arranged to have a modest, wooden accessibility ramp built at the front door of Amelia's townhouse. The idea was simple, a short, gently sloping ramp to bypass the 4 steps that led to the small stoop. Since the Homeowners Association, HOA, bylaws in Marigold Townhomes encouraged reasonable accommodations for disabilities, Julie assumed installing the ramp would be straightforward. Yet, unbeknownst to them, there was a complication. Miranda Barnett, the self-appointed watchdog of the HOA, who was known by many neighbors as Karen, behind her back. This middle-aged woman wore her hair in a severe bob, marched the sidewalks with a clipboard, and loved reciting snippets of official guidelines at the slightest provocation. Miranda had recently taken on a more influential role within the HOA board, a position that gave her the power to interpret rules as she saw fit. When Miranda first laid eyes on the construction materials, boards of cedar, angled beams, a set of brackets, piled in front of Amelia's unit, she felt a familiar prickle of indignation. She had not been personally consulted. Why would someone build a structure on the exterior of a townhouse without going through the proper channels? She was determined to figure out if this was permissible or if she could mount a challenge under the guise of maintaining community aesthetics. That afternoon, Miranda marched up the short walkway to Amelia's door, clipboard clutched to her side. She knocked firmly and then took 2 steps back, putting on her official face. Amelia answered with a pleasant smile. Up close, Miranda noticed that Amelia's posture was stooped, and she leaned slightly on a cane. "Good afternoon," Miranda said. "I'm with the HOA. I see you're having some construction done. May I see the permit?" Amelia blinked, taken aback. "Permit? My daughter spoke to someone on the board, I believe, about building a small accessibility ramp. It's not a large project, just a short walkway from my door to the driveway." Miranda's lips thinned. "Yes, well, the official request must be filed and approved by the board in writing. Did your daughter do that?" Amelia hesitated. "I'm not entirely sure. She said she sent an email to." She paused, searching her memory. "I believe it was email protected. That's the contact address from the welcome packet, right? My daughter said it was important to let the HOA know about the ramp." Miranda's expression remained steely. "We only received an email mentioning the possibility of a ramp. No official documentation or design layout was attached. We can't allow random modifications without thorough inspection to ensure it matches the community's aesthetic standards." She glanced pointedly at the lumber. "I can't guarantee this addition will be approved." Amelia, though frail, mustered a calm but firm tone. "I'm allowed a ramp. The rules say reasonable modifications for medical needs are acceptable. I've read the manual, Miss Barnett." She tried to smile disarmingly. "I do appreciate the concern for safety. My daughter found a licensed carpenter who's building it to code." Miranda, not used to being so bluntly resisted, narrowed her eyes. "Then I hope everything is done correctly. We can't have deformed structures lowering property values." The words stung, but Amelia managed a dignified nod. "Of course, we'll follow the rules." Miranda left with her usual abruptness, ignoring the gentle, "have a nice day," that Amelia offered. As she walked away, her mind raced with annoyance. She didn't like that an exception was being made for one individual, even if it was for a valid disability. In her eyes, uniformity was paramount. If one person built a ramp, perhaps others would start adding unapproved features too. Unsightly hedges, extended patios, or garish paint colors. That was the kind of slippery slope she prided herself on preventing. Construction on Amelia's ramp began in earnest the following day. The carpenter, Dwayne Phillips, was a kindly local man with decades of experience building decks, staircases, and ramps. He arrived with his tools, meticulously measured angles, and explained the plan to Amelia and Julie. It would be a minimal slope from Amelia's doorway to the driveway, supported by strong wooden beams anchored in concrete footings. The railings would be painted white to match the trim of the townhouse, ensuring everything looked neat and cohesive. Julie was pleased. "This is going to be great, Mom. You'll be able to enter and exit without wrestling those steps." Amelia beamed, imagining the relief it would bring. Despite having only a small cane, she found the steps daunting, especially on days when her arthritis flared. Not everyone was pleased, however. Miranda, unofficially dubbed Karen around the neighborhood, took to pacing by daily, scribbling notes on her clipboard. From behind the blinds in her own unit across the cul-de-sac, she watched with a simmering sense of intrusion. She just knew there was a regulation being bent or broken. If not about the ramp's structural design, then about its color or the exact distance from the property line. She searched old HOA documents, combing through paragraphs of fine print, hoping to discover a clause that would support blocking the project. Meanwhile, neighbors began to notice Miranda's fixation. One or two even asked her, "Miranda, what's the problem? Ms. Jennings needs a ramp. It's no big deal." She'd reply with stony words about preserving uniformity and abiding by the written procedures. But in private, the rumor was that she simply hated any disruption to the tidy row of near-identical stoops. The tension hit a peak after a brief but heavy afternoon rain shower. Dwayne had covered the lumber with tarps to prevent water damage, but some boards still lay out in the open. Miranda marched straight over in her poncho, lifted a corner of the tarp, and muttered to Dwayne, "You're letting the materials soak. That can't be safe. Are you sure you're building something stable?" Dwayne calmly explained that the wood was pressure-treated and rated for outdoor use. Rain wouldn't compromise its integrity. Miranda rolled her eyes and made a show of writing a note on her clipboard. Amelia, seeing the scene unfold from her window, felt her heart sink a little. She loathed conflict, especially in a neighborhood she had chosen for peace. But she needed this ramp. That evening, Miranda vented on the neighborhood's private social media group, claiming that certain residents think they can build unsightly ramps without full permission. Some neighbors, especially those who liked or admired Amelia, responded with polite pushback. "A ramp is hardly unsightly, Karen, or the ramp helps a disabled resident. Let's show compassion." Instead of softening Miranda's stance, however, the pushback fueled her resentment. She typed back, "Compassion can't override property values or the look of our townhouses. If we start ignoring guidelines now, we'll have chaos before long." That single post set the tone for the days to come. Miranda felt justified in her stance, while the neighbors, increasingly fed up, saw her as petty and heartless. Some quietly took to calling her the ramp police, or simply Karen, mocking the fact that she liked to make everything her business. Small jokes circulated. "Don't let Karen see your welcome mat, or you'll have to file an official request." Miranda pretended not to notice the jibes, but inwardly, she seethed. She saw herself as a rightful enforcer of order. Over the years, she had intimidated more than one neighbor into repainting a door or removing a yard ornament, all under the claim that the HOA says so. In her mind, she was the only one with the backbone to do what was necessary to maintain the aesthetic standards that set Marigold townhomes above other developments. She couldn't let a ramp ruin that. Despite Miranda's meddling, Dwayne finished building the ramp within the week. The final structure was practical yet modest. A gentle slope, about 3 feet wide, with a white railing on one side and a matching white barrier along the outer edge to prevent accidental slips. The wood itself was sealed with a clear protective finish, blending nicely with the townhouse's trim and siding. When Amelia first tested the ramp, she nearly cried from relief. "It's so easy now," she told Dwayne. Her cane clicked on the smooth wooden surface as she walked carefully down, then back up, with minimal strain on her joints. Neighbors walking by smiled and congratulated her on the new feature. Even those who had never formally met Amelia found themselves nodding approvingly. Julie, who had come to check on her mother that evening, sighed happily. I'm glad you can get around more safely now, Mom. This is what we wanted. The next morning, a few neighbors stopped to admire the ramp. One of them, a sweet woman named Helen Cruz, handed Amelia a bouquet of daisies. We think this is wonderful, Amelia, Helen said. Don't worry about Miranda. She can fuss all she wants. The rest of us support you. Word spread around the development that Ms. Jennings's ramp was a positive addition, not an eyesore. Several neighbors commented that it was tastefully built and hardly noticeable compared to what they'd initially feared after reading Miranda's rants. The general consensus was that it improved accessibility and didn't harm property values in the slightest. Amelia felt her spirits lift with each kind comment. She hoped this signaled the end of all the negativity. However, the uneasy tension didn't vanish entirely. Miranda's chilly gaze across the cul-de-sac gave no sign of acceptance. In fact, as the days rolled on, she became even more distant and curt. Behind closed doors, Miranda brooded. In her mind, the ramp was a perfect example of a slippery slope. She imagined neighbors next adding random deck extensions or painting their shutters neon colors, then citing personal preference to bypass the rules. She despised that the ramp had been built so quickly, with minimal friction from the HOA. She had lobbied for the board to demand changes, but a majority had voted to allow it. One board member even said, "It's an ADA accommodation. We need to comply unless there's a compelling reason not to." Deformed architecture, Miranda fumed, repeating the phrase in her mind. That's what she truly believed the ramp to be, an architectural blemish scarring the uniform row of townhouses. She found it ugly. She believed the gentle slope was too large, that it blocked the sidewalk, even though, in reality, it didn't. In her darkest moments, she fantasized about the ramp just disappearing. That was the only way to preserve the unbroken line of stoops. It started as a mere rumor. Some neighbors gossiped that Miranda had once destroyed a row of hedges behind the community pool because they weren't in the official landscaping plan. She had used pruning shears until the shrubs were little more than stumps. The HOA ended up replanting them at a different location, further fueling Miranda's sense of power in the neighborhood. "If they can't abide by the guidelines, I'll do it myself," she was rumored to have said back then. When those hushed stories made their way to Julie's ears, she dismissed them at first. Surely, she wouldn't stoop to harming someone else's property, Julie told her mother. That's going too far. But Amelia wasn't so certain. She had seen the fiery look in Miranda's eyes, the disdain on her face whenever they crossed paths. Miranda seemed personally offended by the ramp's existence. To ease her mind, Amelia installed a small motion-sensing light outside her front door. It wasn't expensive, just a basic security measure. "I'd rather be safe than sorry," she told her daughter. If someone did approach the ramp with ill intent, the sudden flood of light might discourage them. Julie also mentioned installing a camera. "Let me cover the cost, Mom," she insisted, but Amelia waved it off. She didn't want her home feeling like a fortress. "Let's trust in the better nature of people for now," she said. Across the street, Miranda noticed the new security light. It flicked on whenever a stray cat wandered too close or a neighbor walked by. Instead of reading it as a sign that Amelia felt uneasy, Miranda took it personally. "They're playing the victim," she told one of her close HOA allies, Cynthia Pepper, a friend who sometimes agreed with Miranda's strict interpretations. "Now the woman thinks I'm going to vandalize her house. It's insulting." Cynthia shrugged, uncertain. "It's her right to install a light, Miranda. Don't let it get under your skin." But the advice came too late. Miranda's resentment had festered too deeply. The neighborhood was split. Some quietly feared that Miranda might, indeed, do something drastic. Others considered that possibility too extreme. After all, sabotage was a crime, and Miranda, despite being controlling, seemed too image-conscious to risk an arrest. But they didn't know how dangerously Miranda's frustration had grown. Alone at night, she sometimes glared at the ramp from her window, replaying each moment that had undermined her authority. She believed the entire neighborhood was turning against her. That sense of alienation only fueled a desperate desire to prove she was right. One sunny Saturday, Amelia emerged from her townhouse, carefully navigating her cane and stepping onto the ramp. She was headed to the grocery store with Julie, who was idling at the curb with the engine running. Just as Amelia reached the bottom of the ramp, Miranda appeared, marching across the cul-de-sac with her clipboard in hand. Ms. Jennings, Miranda called out with forced politeness. A moment, if you please. Amelia paused, her heart sinking. Yes. Miranda stepped up, tapping her clipboard. We've received reports that your ramp might be blocking part of the common walkway. I need to verify the measurements. Amelia frowned. Blocking the walkway? It doesn't even extend onto the sidewalk. There's a gap. You can clearly walk around it. Miranda pressed on, ignoring the logic. The official guidelines specify that any structure must maintain a clear distance from the property line, typically 3 feet. I need to confirm you haven't breached that boundary. Amelia sighed. As I said before, everything was built to code. The contractor measured carefully. I'm not sure what else to tell you. I'll be the judge of that, Miranda retorted, flipping open a tape measure. She walked along the edge of the ramp, letting the metal tape zip out with a harsh whir. She stooped to measure the distance between the ramp and the sidewalk. Then she scribbled notes, lips pursed. I'll have to compare these figures to the exact property maps. If there's a violation, the ramp will have to be moved or removed. Suddenly, Julie got out of the car. She'd been watching from the driver's seat. Excuse me, Ms. Barnett? This ramp is within every legal and HOA standard. I made sure of it. My mother shouldn't have to endure these constant threats. She's done nothing wrong. Miranda's cheeks reddened. She responded, It's not personal, just the rules. If you want a ramp, you have to comply with the guidelines. Julie's temper flared. We did comply. You're the one bent on finding a problem where none exists. You're harassing a senior citizen. Miranda gasped, looking around as though searching for an ally. A couple of neighbors peered out from their own windows. The confrontation was becoming a spectacle. Amelia, hating public drama, gently tugged on her daughter's sleeve. Julie, let's go. We're going to be late. Yet, Miranda had one last barb. If the measurements are off, I'll be forced to file a formal complaint. Don't blame me when the HOA forces you to tear it down. With that, she spun around and stalked off, head high. Julie muttered under her breath as she helped her mother into the car. Amelia felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. Was Miranda's threat real? She tried to reassure herself that logic would prevail. Any legitimate inspection would show the ramp was fine. But a nagging worry remained. Miranda seemed determined, perhaps unhinged, about having her way. That night, Amelia confided in Julie that she was starting to regret moving here. I love the townhouse, but not this constant tension. It can't be good for my health. Julie assured her mother that it would blow over. Let's trust in the official channels, Mom. She can't do anything if the ramp is truly within the rules. Yet, something in Miranda's eyes suggested otherwise. It was that cold glint of certainty, the unwavering belief that she could correct what she perceived as a neighborhood offense, one way or another. The sabotage itself happened late at night, around 1 a.m. According to subsequent accounts, the neighborhood was quiet, most lights off. A crescent moon offered scant illumination. The new motion-sensing light outside Amelia's door flicked on once or twice, triggered by passing stray cats, but eventually it switched back to darkness. In the shadows, a figure approached the ramp. Dressed in dark clothing and holding a handsaw, the intruder knelt beside the wooden beams supporting the structure. The sound of metal teeth biting into wood might have carried on the wind, but the swirling breeze likely masked it. Slowly, with determined strokes, the saboteur weakened the support posts. Crack by crack, the beams splintered. The wood was thick, so it wasn't a quick job. Yet the intruder persisted, adrenaline fueling each pull of the saw's blade. After slicing through enough beams to compromise the ramp's structural integrity, the figure left. A hush fell over the cul-de-sac again, the only sign of wrongdoing a faint scatter of sawdust on the lawn. When dawn arrived, no one immediately noticed what had happened. Amelia slept in that morning, her arthritis flaring up. The first clue came from a neighbor, Mr. Curtis Kim, who liked to jog past the row of townhouses. He saw something off about the ramp. It appeared slanted and partially collapsed. Alarmed, he rushed to ring Amelia's doorbell. Amelia, frightened by the urgent knocks, opened the door to see Mr. Kim panting and pointing at the ramp. It looks like part of it fell in, he said, voice tense. Amelia peered out, eyes widening. The ramp was warped. Two of the main support posts had completely sheared, leaving the structure partially canted to one side. If she'd tried to step on it, she likely would have fallen. Confusion and dread filled Amelia's face. How? Did the rain damage it? She asked, mind racing for a plausible explanation. But it had been dry the previous night. Then she noticed the distinct saw marks on the wooden edges, an unmistakable sign of a deliberate cut. Her heart pounded. Someone had done this on purpose. News spread quickly. Julie rushed over, furious and frightened. Neighbors gathered in small clusters, staring at the vandalized ramp. Whispers flew. Who would do something like this? Was it a burglary attempt? But as more people arrived, the conversation inevitably turned to Miranda, her loud protests and ominous threats. Some recalled that she had once boasted about enforcing the rules herself. A few neighbors even saw Miranda's silhouette in her window that morning, watching from behind the curtains. She didn't come out to ask questions or offer help. She simply observed, her blinds occasionally flicking. To many, it was a silent admission of guilt. Amelia felt violated and unsafe. As soon as the reality sank in, tears welled in her eyes. I can't believe someone would sabotage my ramp, she said, voice trembling. Julie gave her mother's hand a reassuring squeeze. We'll fix it, Mom. Don't worry. Neighbors tried to comfort her, offering to help clean up the mess. Among them was Helen Cruz, who arrived with her husband carrying a portable toolkit. Another neighbor, Ronald Pierce, who worked construction, carefully examined the damage. This was no accident, Ronald said grimly. Someone cut through the supports, probably with a handsaw or a reciprocating saw. It's definitely vandalism. They debated calling the police. Julie insisted on it. This is property damage, and it endangered my mother's life. Amelia, though reluctant to escalate matters, agreed that a report should be filed. Soon, 2 local officers arrived, took statements, and photographed the crime scene. They promised to open an investigation, though they admitted leads might be scarce if there were no cameras capturing the act. That mention of cameras brought guilt to Julie's mind. She recalled how she'd wanted to install one. If they had done so, they might have caught the culprit on video. Amelia insisted she didn't want to live in a fortress, but now she wondered if a camera would have prevented the sabotage. She gazed at the broken ramp, feeling a knot in her stomach. As word reached the wider HOA membership, shock turned to outrage. The idea that someone would target a senior citizen's ramp was appalling. Even HOA members who were previously neutral felt incensed. The board convened an emergency meeting to discuss how to handle the vandalism and support Amelia. Miranda showed up at the meeting. She sat stiffly in a chair near the front, arms crossed. A ripple of discomfort went through the attendees. Many suspected her involvement, but no one had direct proof. Some stared daggers at her. Others avoided eye contact altogether. The HOA president, a measured man named Mark Garrison, opened the meeting by condemning the vandalism. We stand with Ms. Jennings, he said firmly. We do not tolerate acts of destruction or sabotage in this community. We urge anyone with information to come forward. Miranda cleared her throat. Yes, well, we should also consider that if the ramp was constructed incorrectly, it might have collapsed on its own. There's no guarantee it was sabotage. Her remark ignited a wave of gasps and a few muttered curses from the crowd. Helen Cruz couldn't hold back. There were clear saw marks. How dare you imply otherwise? Miranda shrugged. I'm only stating possibilities. We have no proof. Mark Garrison raised his voice. We have a police report stating that sabotage is the most likely scenario. Miranda maintained her composure. Yes, but unless the culprit is identified, we shouldn't jump to conclusions. Her posture was that of someone carefully deflecting suspicion, but the meeting's mood was palpably against her. Even those once sympathetic to her strict approach recognized the cruelty in the sabotage. Miranda's words, rather than distancing herself from wrongdoing, seemed to confirm many people's suspicions. She was the only one who truly hated the ramp enough to do something like that. At the meeting's close, the HOA formally condemned the act, promising to help Amelia rebuild. They also voted to set aside a small fund to improve security, like encouraging more porch lights or even partial reimbursements for doorbell cameras. The entire time, Miranda sat silently, her expression unreadable. Amelia felt an outpouring of support in the days that followed. Neighbors dropped off meals, flowers, and cards expressing sympathy. A local volunteer group offered to help clear away the damaged ramp. In a spontaneous show of solidarity, several people, led by Ronald Pierce and Helen Cruz's husband, organized a small repair brigade to remove the broken wood, dispose of it properly, and start planning a replacement. Julie was overwhelmed by the kindness. I didn't realize how caring everyone was, she said, tears in her eyes, as neighbors hammered away at the twisted remains of the ramp. Mom, you have a whole community that has your back. Amelia, still shaken, managed a grateful smile. I didn't expect all this, she admitted, but it means the world to me. The next question was how to rebuild. Ronald and a few others wanted to do it themselves, but the sabotage showed them that the ramp might be a continuous target. They debated if a simple volunteer job was enough or if they should involve a professional to install a sturdier, tamper-proof design. Many favored the professional route, given the seriousness of the vandalism. The last thing anyone wanted was for the ramp to be sabotaged again. One evening, Ronald stood in front of Amelia's townhouse, going over sketches for a possible new design with a licensed contractor friend, Marina Chow. The plan was for a code-compliant ramp with steel-reinforced posts. Marina suggested adding aesthetic touches, a decorative railing, built-in planters, and a subtle, matching paint scheme to blend well with the townhouse facade. We can make it look so good that the HOA itself will be proud to show it off, she explained. That way, no one can say it's ugly or an eyesore. The idea excited Amelia and Julie. They wanted something that would not only be functional, but also add a bit of charm. The neighbors chimed in with suggestions. What if we add solar-powered lights along the railing? We could place flower boxes with seasonal blooms, so it's visually appealing. Even some HOA board members got on board, praising the idea of a ramp that could serve as a model for future accessibility projects. Miranda, however, remained notably silent about the renewed plans. Some neighbors cornered her in passing, asking if she was going to protest again. She would only respond with curt remarks like, "I have no statement at this time." Many suspected she was seething underneath her carefully guarded exterior. But the wave of positivity overshadowed Miranda's negativity. The community felt determined to stand up against intimidation. Funds were collected, volunteer labor offered. The contractor, Marina, offered a discounted rate, feeling it was a morally just cause. The HOA pledged partial financial support, an unprecedented move that hammered home the point. The neighborhood valued accessibility, and they refused to let a vandal get the last word. Mark Garrison convened a special HOA meeting to review the final design. The mood was markedly different from the tense session following the vandalism. This time, the board members and neighbors gathered with a sense of purpose, excited to give official approval. Marina displayed diagrams. The ramp would have a sturdy framework, anchored with steel hardware, encased in weatherproof wood that could handle the region's climate. The ramp's edges would integrate planters for small shrubs or flowers. A discrete row of solar lights along the top rail would make it safely lit after dark and visually pleasing. When the meeting opened for questions, a few people inquired about cost, potential impacts on property values, and timeline. Marina answered calmly and confidently, explaining how a well-built ramp that looks professionally integrated actually raises property values by boosting curb appeal. She added that it was the right thing to do for future residents who might need similar accommodations. Miranda was conspicuously absent at first. Then, just as the board prepared to vote, she strode in, wearing a pressed blouse and the usual clipped expression. "Sorry for the delay," she said, voice tight. She took a seat in the back, arms crossed, scowling at the diagrams as though they offended her. Still, she stayed silent. The board's vote was unanimous in favor of the new design. Applause erupted. Neighbors turned to each other, smiling. The sabotage had been a gut punch, but the unified response filled everyone with pride. The ramp would be rebuilt, better, stronger, and more beautiful than ever. Mark Garrison concluded the meeting by saying, "This is a testament to Marigold Townhome's resilience and spirit of community." Miranda marched out without a word. Some neighbors speculated that she might try to file a late grievance or push for a hearing to delay construction. But the board's decision was binding. There was no legitimate way to stall it. The plan was to begin the rebuild as soon as the materials and the contractor's schedule aligned, likely within a couple of weeks. That night, Amelia slept more soundly than she had in days. For the first time since the ramp's destruction, she felt a ray of hope. The neighbors, the HOA board, and even professional contractors were rallying behind her. She prayed that once the new ramp was in place, the community could move forward with no further hostility. Meanwhile, Behind the drawn shades of her unit, Miranda sat in a swirl of conflicting emotions. Part of her still believed the ramp was an eyesore, deformed architecture, as she'd once called it. Another part of her worried that suspicion for the sabotage was hanging over her head like a storm cloud. She had no idea if the police might find evidence linking her to the act. She berated herself for not wearing gloves or for leaving footprints. Had she been careful enough? Fear and pride battled within her. Ultimately, her pride won out. She convinced herself that no one could prove anything. Still, a kernel of anxiety remained, gnawing at her sense of self-righteousness. In early autumn, the rebuilding project took shape. Marina and her small crew arrived early one morning, methodically unloading lumber, steel brackets, and bags of concrete for the footings. Curious neighbors watched from their windows or strolled by to chat, offering coffee or snacks. There was a shared excitement, almost like a neighborhood block party. Amelia, leaning on her cane, observed from her doorway. Although the sabotage had shaken her, she now brimmed with gratitude. "It's so kind of everyone to come together like this," she said to Helen Cruz, who brought over some homemade muffins. "I never imagined such a large group effort would happen just for me." Helen patted Amelia's arm gently. "It's for all of us, really. Accessibility matters, and we want to make a statement that we won't be bullied." Miranda lurked across the street, occasionally peering out from her curtains. She didn't approach the work zone, nor did she make a fuss in the HOA chat group anymore. She found it safer to keep a low profile, especially with the recent police presence around the sabotage. A single slip of the tongue, and she might incriminate herself. Over the next few days, the new structure took form. Marina's crew removed any lingering debris from the old ramp and poured new footings deeper into the ground. In the early mornings, the hum of a drill or the rhythmic tapping of a hammer filled the crisp air. By late afternoon, the skeleton of the ramp stood proudly, reinforced with steel. The slope matched code requirements precisely. Planter boxes were framed in. Though incomplete, one could already see how much sturdier and more polished it would be compared to the first ramp. Julie visited regularly, offering thanks to the workers. She also spoke discreetly with Officer Levine, one of the policemen investigating the sabotage. "Any leads?" she'd ask. Officer Levine always shook his head, disappointed. "We don't have enough to pin it on someone. No witnesses, no clear fingerprints. But if anything new surfaces, we'll pursue it." Julie bristled at the fact that Miranda seemed to be getting away with it, but she recognized the limits of the law in cases without solid evidence. Instead, she channeled her energy into ensuring the new ramp was as secure as possible. She even asked if Marina could install a small tamper alarm on the structure, a hidden sensor that would squeal if someone tried to saw or remove a support beam. Marina agreed, weaving the alarm into the ramp's design so it wouldn't be visible at a glance. By the weekend, the ramp was nearly finished. Fresh paint glistened in the afternoon sun. The planters along each side were empty for the moment, awaiting soil and flowers. The railing was smooth, with no rough edges that might catch on clothing or irritate Amelia's hand. Neighbors passing by marveled at how the ramp actually enhanced the look of the townhouse, blending in seamlessly with the overall design of the building. Amelia's heart swelled with relief. She even managed to try a tentative step onto the partially completed ramp, just enough to feel the firm solidity beneath her feet. "I never thought I'd see the day," she murmured, grateful tears threatening to fall. "It's beautiful." Over the next week, the ramp's final aesthetic touches were added. A handful of neighbors brought small potted plants, from cheerful marigolds to trailing ivy, to place in the built-in planters. Julie and Amelia sorted them by color and style, creating a pleasing arrangement. "It's wonderful," said Ronald Pierce, snapping photos on his phone. "I might submit one to the local paper. They sometimes do feel-good stories about community projects." Others nodded enthusiastically. It wasn't often that neighbors came together in such a personal and positive way. One morning, a group of residents, mostly retirees and stay-at-home parents, gathered at the ramp with bags of potting mix and gardening gloves. Amelia supervised from a lawn chair, telling them how she loved bright orange blossoms because they reminded her of sunrise. Within an hour, the planters were filled with fresh soil and the plants snugly arranged. The transformation was stunning. The ramp no longer seemed like a mere wooden structure. It was an integral part of the townhouse, accented by greenery and blooms, connected to the walkway by a gentle slope. When evening fell, the solar lights along the railing created a soft glow, guiding anyone approaching or exiting the house. It felt welcoming, not just to Amelia, but to any guest who might visit. That same evening, the HOA board members, including Mark Garrison, stopped by to assess the finished project. They expressed unanimous approval. "This is exactly what we hoped to see," Mark said, addressing Amelia and the volunteers. "A safe, code-compliant ramp that seamlessly fits our community's aesthetic. Excellent work." They all shared a toast with plastic cups of sparkling cider. Someone called it an unofficial dedication. A neighbor joked that they should affix a little plaque reading "Community Ramp," signifying the unity that brought it to life. The mood was festive, with children darting around the sidewalks, neighbors laughing, and a sense of relief that the fiasco might finally be over. Across the street, a single figure peered out from the shadows of a curtained window, Miranda. She watched as everyone celebrated. No one had invited her. No one had even glanced her way. Her usual sense of smugness was replaced by a hollow emptiness. In her mind, they were celebrating a structure she had personally tried to prevent. Worse, they'd built something better than the original, something that apparently the entire community loved. It stung her pride in ways she couldn't articulate. Yet, she dared not make a scene. The risk of drawing suspicion was too high. So she stood there, an uninvited onlooker, gritting her teeth at the irony. Her destructive act had catalyzed a ramp that was not only more stable, but also more beautiful, and now fully sanctioned by the HOA. In the wake of the ramp's completion, Miranda's standing in the community plummeted. While no one had conclusive proof tying her to the vandalism, the circumstantial evidence loomed large. She was the only vocal opponent of the ramp. She'd threatened its removal, and she had a known history of taking matters into her own hands. Neighbors were polite but distant in her presence. Gone were the days when she could walk around with her clipboard and bark orders about yard maintenance. Residents now openly challenged her. If she tried to call out someone for violating guidelines, they'd retort, "I'll check with the actual HOA board, thanks." Miranda found herself shunned at block gatherings and social events. Even Cynthia Pepper, her one-time ally, kept her distance, unwilling to share in Miranda's tarnished reputation. Karen, the mocking nickname once whispered behind her back, now spread more openly. Teenagers used it on social media posts about her. Adults mentioned it with a knowing smirk. Miranda felt betrayed. She'd always believed she was protecting the community's best interests. Now, they treated her like a pariah. In a desperate bid to reclaim authority, she tried to propose new aesthetic guidelines at an HOA meeting. She arrived with a folder full of color samples and strict rules about landscaping. But the board shut her down immediately. "We're focusing on unity and practical improvements," Mark Garrison said. "We're not looking to add more restrictions right now." Miranda's face burned with humiliation, but she had no choice but to nod and leave it at that. The board was firmly allied with the large majority of residents who found her tactics overbearing. She recognized that her influence had eroded. People no longer cowered under her demands. Meanwhile, Amelia's ramp became a heartwarming symbol of resilience. The final step was installing a small engraved plaque by the planters, reading, "Access for all, built with love by the Marigold Townhomes community." Amelia insisted on acknowledging the volunteers and the HOA for their support. She also quietly included a note in her daily prayers for whoever committed the vandalism, hoping they'd find peace and remorse. The ramp also sparked conversations about accessibility beyond just Amelia's townhouse. A few other residents with mobility challenges asked if they might be able to add grab bars or small ramps at their own stoops. Mark Garrison and the board quickly drafted new guidelines that simplified the process for gaining approval. Instead of facing extensive paperwork, they allowed a straightforward approach for medically necessary accommodations. It was a direct result of witnessing what Amelia went through. Even more surprising was how the ramp drew neighbors together socially. Children sometimes sat on its edge, watching squirrels dart across the lawns. Retirees gathered by the planters, chatting after their morning walks. Amelia would greet them all, offering a glass of cold lemonade or iced tea. The ramp's open design and decorative flair turned it into a subtle neighborhood hub. Thus, the hateful act that had been meant to intimidate Amelia ended up bolstering a sense of community pride. "This is the best this cul-de-sac has ever felt," commented Helen Cruz one afternoon. We're actually talking to each other, helping each other. It's like an old-fashioned neighborhood. Julie, who visited every weekend, marveled at the transformation. She noted that her mother seemed more socially active than she had been in years. Mom, you're always outside, smiling, chatting. It's like you have a new lease on life, Julie said, hugging Amelia on the ramp's landing. Amelia's eyes sparkled with joy. Yes, I almost feel young again, she whispered. One quiet evening, Miranda stepped out to take her trash to the curb. The sun had set, and the streetlights cast pale circles on the pavement. She paused near the sidewalk, looking across at Amelia's townhouse. The ramp glowed softly under the solar lights, flanked by the planters of flowers that seemed to glow like gems. From her angle, Miranda could see Amelia sitting on the ramp's top landing, chatting with Helen Cruz. They were laughing softly, the warm hum of conversation drifting across the still air. For a moment, Miranda felt an unexpected pang, something like guilt or envy. She recalled how she'd once thought the ramp was an eyesore. Now, she could recognize, even if she'd never admit it publicly, that it was actually quite lovely, adding a charm the original stoop lacked. She lingered there, hidden by the evening gloom, feeling an unusual tightness in her chest. She'd always believed that her brand of rigid enforcement was best for the community. But the sabotage had escalated far beyond any rational justification. Had she let her anger and pride push her to do something unforgivable? In that fleeting moment, Miranda felt regret, a gnawing awareness that she'd crossed a moral line. But she was too stubborn and too fearful to confess to anyone. So she slipped back inside her own townhouse, clutching that moment of guilt like a secret burden. Time marched forward. The ramp stood firm, admired by all. Months passed without any further acts of vandalism, and while no one was ever officially charged, the rumor that Miranda was the culprit persisted. The police file remained open but inactive. Life in Marigold Townhomes returned to a state of calm, but a better calm, enhanced by the closeness the ramp project had fostered. Amelia grew more confident in her movements, often taking short strolls around the neighborhood using her cane, then returning to rest on the ramp. She brightened the planters each season, poinsettias at Christmas, tulips in the spring, petunias in the summer. Neighbors would compliment the colors, ask about her day, and sometimes bring treats to share. Even the HOA, which had been overshadowed by Miranda's tyrannical approach, experienced a renewed sense of purpose. They adopted simpler processes for addressing concerns and placed a stronger emphasis on empathy. Mark Garrison's leadership style set the tone, neighborly cooperation over rigid rule enforcement. He would say, "We can preserve our community's aesthetics while also supporting each other," a line that became a sort of motto. Meanwhile, Miranda maintained a low-key existence. Her initial attempts to push new restrictions or raise property value fears met with apathy. She attended fewer HOA meetings, made fewer waves. Some say they saw her turning away from the window more often, unwilling to watch the warmth and connection that thrived around Amelia's ramp. Whether she truly felt remorse or simply recognized she was outnumbered, no one could say for certain. Her once intimidating presence became little more than an afterthought. The final twist of fate arrived on an unseasonably warm afternoon in early spring. A small group of neighbors had gathered near Amelia's ramp for a spontaneous chat. The conversation flowed from gardening tips to local events. Amelia, who had a gentle sense of humor, casually remarked, "If not for the ramp sabotage, we might never have made all these new friendships. Strange how life works, isn't it?" Helen Cruz nodded, adding, "Whoever tried to destroy our sense of community only made it stronger." A ripple of agreement passed through the group. Amelia smiled, resting her hand on the smooth railing. "This ramp is living proof that kindness can blossom in response to cruelty. I'm thankful every day." No one needed to say Miranda's name. Her actions, destructive though they were, had inadvertently sparked something wonderful. The final ramp was more stable, more beautiful, and undeniably permanent. Officially endorsed by the HOA, beloved by neighbors, and serving as a symbol of unity against the harshness of intolerance. Amelia gazed over the bright flowers adorning the planters, the sunlight dancing on the glossy wood. For all the heartache and fear it had caused, the saga ended with a clear, uplifting message. When good neighbors unite, Even the most spiteful attempts to tear a community apart can lead to a stronger, happier outcome.